Welcome back. This is AP US History. This is Chapter 6, Part 3. Now, we had finished talking about the Townshend Act. Now, the next big act that comes down the pike is the Tea Act, which is passed in 1773. And we said that the ironic part was that people were actually paying a lower cost for the tea even after the tax was placed on the tea. The British East India Company, which had a monopoly on all tea being sold on the colonists, was on the verge of bankrupt, and they needed to sell the tea. It was about $70,000 worth of tea on 3 different ships. The tax on the tea, again, for expenses for the crown. The Stamp Act, again, just kind of a recap. Many members of Parliament held shares in this East India Company, and they were anxious to get this thing sold so the company would not go bankrupt. The tea actually was cheaper than had been in past years. North expected the colonists to eagerly choose the cheaper tea. He was a prime minister at the time. The colonists refused to buy the tea. It sets in Boston Harbor, and our old friends, the Sons of Liberty, up to a little mischief. They dressed again as Indians, as they did in the case of the burning of the Gaspee, that British warship off the Rhode Island. And they will throw the tea into the bay and claim that Native Americans did it. The poor Native Americans. In 1774, what Parliament will pass the Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts, to make the British citizens, or the Boston citizens, pay for the tea that's been destroyed. They didn't buy the fact that Native Americans threw it into the harbor. As part of this Coercive Acts, Boston is closed, no more shipping. Massachusetts loses its charter. Town meetings prohibited in Boston. British officials who killed a colonist would be tried in England. Up to this time, if a British soldier committed a crime in the colonies, he would be tried in a colonial court. Here's a picture of the Boston Tea Party in 1775. Lord North, again, the Port Bill, the Government Act. The new Quartering Act said that colonists would have to put up soldiers free of charge, and also feed them. And so representation is taken away. The colonists, particularly Massachusetts, are up in arms that such a law would be passed, and they're going to look for some relief. The Quartering Act forced the Bostons again to put the British troops into private homes. The Quebec Act, which really was not intended to punish the colonists, but is seen as a slight by the British towards the colonists. Actually, the Quebec Act was a fairly enlightened piece of legislation. It allowed the French Canadians to practice Catholicism. It expanded the Canadian territory into the Ohio River area, and it allowed the French Canadians to keep their customs and traditions. Being Protestants, the people of Boston saw this as a slap in the face. They weren't anxious to see Catholics receiving more rights than they were experiencing. And this was the Quebec Act. This area extending down from the Great Lakes was going to be attached to Canada. So this Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts, are hoisted on the people of Boston. The First Continental Congress will convene to address the Intolerable Acts, that they call it, on their brothers in Boston. Boston agreed to end all trade with Britain and invite the other colonists to join the resistance, as they had done in the Townshend and the Stamp Act. 12 of the 13 colonies met, except Georgia, and they discussed what they should do about the intolerable acts. And also the Quebec Act. Each colony got one vote at this council. The delegations endorsed the Suffolk Resolves, which denounced the intolerable acts and urged colonists to organize a militia for defensive purposes. So the rhetoric gets ratcheted up a little bit, and again, suspending trade with Great Britain. Urged colonists not to pay their taxes and reject the Galloway Plan, which called for a colonial union to approve all parliamentary actions. So they didn't accept that they were all going to have a parliament in the colonies, mainly because they didn't trust each other, for the most part. So the Suffolk Resolves denounced the intolerable acts. The resolves were recognized by the statesman Edmund Burke as a major development of colonial animosity, which is going to later lead to the Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. Congress wrote the Declaration of Resolves, which is kind of a precursor to the Declaration of Independence. At this time, the colonies were not seeking independence. They just wanted to address their grievances to the king. They saw the Parliament as real villains, not necessarily the king. They declared their allegiance to the king, but they saw Parliament as the one being solely responsible for all this mischief. Now, Lexington and Concord will happen in April of 1775. Parliament ordered General Gage to arrest leaders of the rebellion and to seize arms that were suspected to be at Lexington and Concord. So the Declaration of Resolve stating that they were Englishmen and they should therefore treated like Englishmen, but they didn't think so. This shows sort of a chronological order of things leading up to Lexington and Concord. This is, of course, the famous ride of Paul Revere and Dawes, warning that the British are coming, the British are coming, and the Minutemen grabbing their muskets and meeting the British at Lexington. The British fire, or someone fired at Lexington, the British will win. Later on, they will march on to Concord, but the U.S. will win. As a result of this skirmish, 273 British will be killed. Only 95 U.S. or colonists will die. Gage sought to prevent bloodshed by disarming the local militia, and 700 militia went out to seize the gunpowder. And, of course, people are going to be killed. 8 Americans were killed at Lexington and 10 wounded. At Concord, the Americans are reinforced, and they will fight the British, and the British will retreat to Boston. Again, the Americans will lay siege to Boston and bottle up the British soldiers. This shows Paul Revere and Dawes making their famous ride to warn the Minutemen. The shots heard around the world, Lexington and Concord. This shows a picture of the march from Boston to those two locations. First battle, Lexington, was a defeat for the Americans, but Concord will be a victory. So the pluses and minuses for both sides. The British strength during the Revolutionary War. Of course, they had a large population that was at least 3 times larger than the Americans. They had the best navy, 50,000 professional soldiers. They had more Indian alliances. And they also enlisted about 50,000 loyalists in the colonists to fight on their side. So more resources to fight the war. In fact, 20,000 slaves joined the British side, and they were promised freedom. Uh, the British fleet gave the English a tremendous advantage over the colonies, almost on every front. The weakness for the British, they had a logistics problem. The English had to transport their goods a long way. America was a large country to occupy. The British occupied the cities, while the Americans occupied the rural areas. The worst generals in Great Britain were sent to America, and they proved to be poor leaders. Provisions of troops were sometimes inadequate, and sometimes the English troops weren't too disposed about killing their own countrymen. The only thing the Americans had to do was delay or tie, and they would win the ultimate prize, and that's what they did for 8 years. Eventually, France will seize an opportunity to attack England through the Americans. The American strength, outstanding leadership at times, economic and eventually military assistance from France. Defensive military tactics require fewer men. They were agricultural, self-sustaining, so they didn't have to go long distances to receive food. They knew the terrain and believed they were fighting a just cause. Many of the colonists had better muskets and were better marksmen than the British soldiers. One of the technological advantages the Americans had was a Kentucky long rifle that could shoot a longer distance than the British muskets. American weakness, badly organized for the war. No real navy. Army was poorly equipped. There was jealousy among the different colonies, so they weren't a unified group. About 1/3 of the rebels fought, and 1/3 was, well, I'm really not interested, and 1/3 fought for the side of the British. The central government was weak and ineffective, didn't have much money. Here are some of the strongholds for the Loyalists. And so this again shows some of the weaknesses and strengths of the Americans and the British. Just kind of a recap. And we'll stop right there.